Okay, moving on. We'll get into now the Ethiopian Empire. Um, what is fascinating in the Ethiopian experience is that the degree to which they were able to retain a great deal of autonomy for themselves. Um, they were able to, under the Ethiopian Emperor Circe Dingil, they were able to defeat Ottoman attempts to conquer Ethiopia, which dated from about 1572 to 1575. Um, there were also religious developments taking place within the Ethiopian Empire, leading to a sense of kind of cultural complexity. Under Emperor Sasanios, um, the second term or individual on this slide, in 1622, he sided with a pro Jesuit faction in his court and proceeded to go on to proclaim himself a Catholic. But what's interesting here is that many Ethiopians, many of his subjects, remained members of the Ethiopian Church during this period of time. And so, as a result, Ethiopia, the political structure, but also kind of the social and cultural structure, is going to have to deal with these religious differences and the domestic diversity that's beginning to assert itself here. Over the next 150 years or so, Ethiopia was going to maneuver between Christian and Islamic influences. The Portuguese were expelled in 1640 from any type of interaction or infringement upon Ethiopian autonomy. And from 1640 to 1874, we have the installment of the Kera dynasty. Now, this dynasty within Ethiopia had Islamic leanings. They succeeded in opening a pilgrimage route to Mecca by consolidating control in what is known as the Darfur region today, kind of the portions of what is today Sudan. And they were going to be able, because they opened up this route, this meant that they could also profit from the lucrative trade routes of this Red Sea region as well. Not only a major economic artery during this period of time, but also a major economic artery today. From 1667 to 1682, Emperor Johannes ensured acceptance of Orthodox Christians. Muslim merchants could also practice their faith, but interestingly, they had to, or they were required to live within separate communities, kind of, within a Muslim quarter, you might say, of either a community or an urban center. From roughly 1700 to 1800, there is this acceleration of Islamization in the Darfur area, Darfur region. And this was mostly characterized by the influx of Islamic scholars that were encouraged to settle in that region. It wasn't too long ago, maybe a decade or less, in which the Darfur region of Africa was once again front page news with regard to the kind of volatility of that region. Between religious communities or breaking down along religious lines, Islamic versus Christian primarily. So the history behind that dates back to this what we're covering in this course as well, kind of a direct example of how in many cases the historical legacies of a particular area or region or people can have very kind of direct effects and in many cases drive contemporary issues. So these religious issues, combined with changes in social power, begin to erode imperial power within the Ethiopian state itself. Nobles within Ethiopia and within the Ethiopian Empire begin to increase their power and authority. Um, Along the Swahili coast, basically south of Ethiopia and south of the Horn of Africa, we see similar stresses beginning to exist between Muslim merchants and Portuguese settlers. Again, Portuguese being Catholic primarily. So in many cases, Africa itself was a crossroads. It wasn't simply that Africans had to deal with competing and neighboring African communities or tribes or states, but now they were also having to grapple with, at the same time, this kind of growing involvement, intrusion, or interference, you might say, from the wider world as a whole. And in the cases of Christian and Muslim influences, which themselves had a history, not always one that was peaceful, now meant that this was a new part of the world in which those tensions played themselves out that Africans, indigenous Africans, had to deal with now as well. In West Central Africa. So this is the area primarily concerned with what is today parts of the Congo, Angola region. Um, we see the rise of the Congo Kingdom from lasting from about 1500 to 1700. The Congo was influenced by Portuguese arrivals. Um, the What's interesting about the Congo Kingdom itself is that it was something of an anomaly in that it practiced matrilineal kinds of um, uh, organizations or notions of hierarchy. Um, when the Portuguese arrived, that matrilineality and local village autonomy began to decline. And instead, authority begins to fall into the hands of Congolese kings that themselves were converted to Christianity. In many cases, the relationship between these Congolese kings, these monarchs, um, and the Portuguese themselves was very close. Members of the royal family of the Congolese monarchy were schooled in Portugal. So there's kind of today we might consider this to be kind of a cultural um, appropriation in many cases, or a political cultural appropriation. And once the Portuguese arrived, once they established these pretty close, strong bonds with the powers that be, there was the rapid expansion of the slave trade. This would result in militarization of Congolese society as the Portuguese began to and in essence begin to recognize the benefits of not only establishing strong ties with the institutions of authority within a given geographic region, but also to cultivate and begin to undermine or establish relations with elements that might serve to undermine that kind of centralized control. Why would they why would these Portuguese risk doing that? Well, because they want to strike the best deal that they can for themselves. And, instead of dealing with the established power, if they can get a better deal by, creating a an atmosphere of chaos and instability that they could reap benefits from, then so much the better from a Portuguese perspective. And you could argue more widely, a European perspective. So the Portuguese began to do just that. They turned to supporting neighboring rivals in order to, seize land and, more importantly, to seize slaves from the Congo Kingdom itself. From 1665 to 1709, there was a Congolese civil war that the Portuguese also exploited to their their benefit, as I kind of alluded to. Um, there were also within the Congolese social system two classes of slaves: those that were exportable, and those that were deemed too vital um, to be exported and could not be sold, which remained a part of the um, Congo social hierarchy. From as early as 1612, around 10,000 slaves were shipped annually from Angola, this region in the green, just kind of barely on the bottom portion of this map. Um, so 10,000 slaves starting in about 1612 per year were shipped from Angola um, through to the year 1700. And in the 18th century, from that same region, the Angolan region, the export of slaves spiked to around 40,000 slaves per year. Why would that be significant? Well, in the 18th century, beginning about 1750, um, you have the Industrial Revolution beginning to launch itself in England initially. We'll talk about this in future lectures, and we'll begin to quickly kind of uh, become the driving interest and characteristic of the modern world moving forward. When societies, economies, states begin to industrialize, this means that the clamor, the drive, the demand for slaves is going to rise astronomically. And we can see this directly paralleling the experience in Angola um, from the 17th into the 18th century. From 1650 to 1800, you also have the Luango region, which is basically this lavender area just on the top corner of this kind of geographic map. This too became a key slave exporting region. Um, and from 1700 to 1800, Angola, to return to Angola, south of the Congo Kingdom, um, became very cooperative, established cooperative slave trade between the Portuguese, Brazilians, and Africans as well. So you can see now we're moving down. So just off the map here, kind of north and northwest of Luango is the Gold Coast in West Africa. Um, Now we're beginning to move down the coastline southward towards the what is today South Africa and the Cape of Good Hope, and the rounding the southern tip basically of the African continent itself. Getting into that region of Africa. By the late 17th century, the Portuguese begin to lose control of settlements and possessions. Not only in what they had established in and along the eastern portions, excuse me, the western shoreline of the African continent, but also in places like Mozambique as well. As early as 1652, the Dutch East India Company that we talked about began to establish a settlement at Cape Town, what is today South Africa. And in 1707, about a half century later or so, we see the earliest recorded mention of a settler, a Dutch settler, describing himself as an Afrikaner, to add yet another layer of complexity to the further development of identity, um, paralleling in some cases white settlers around the world and their kind of uh, association or relationship with being colonists. So, there is this inflection point where, you know, people colonizing new areas of the world, or what they consider to be new, consider themselves to be subjects or members of the society from which they moved, whether it was English, French, Dutch, you know, Spanish, so on and so forth, to then becoming something different, something that is mutated into some other kind of identity for themselves, whether that be, in this case, Afrikaner in Southern Africa, or American in the English 13 colonies themselves. So, um, you know, this adds kind of another element to identity as far as its expression. That, you know, identities shift and morph over time. So it's very difficult to you have to be very careful with identity, as far as its expression, because you have to kind of, alongside it, qualify it with exactly what time period you're talking about. So Africa here offers us a very unique tapestry as to the developments that took place between roughly the 16th to 18th centuries. On the one hand, there was a shift towards centralized power and militarization in response to slave trade activities. We can see that, you know, kind of in these kinds of groups, um, small kind of organizations, relatively speaking. And in some cases, this meant a concerted effort to regulate um, who was eligible for export and who was not, in the case of the Congolese experience. But on the other hand, of course, um, we see various kingdoms and empires of Africa beginning to retain a high degree of autonomy for themselves. Notably, um, in Ethiopia being, I think, really kind of the forerunner, the kind of go-to example of that. But also, to a certain measured degree, we can see that in the Congo Kingdom, in Benin to a certain extent, and a few others. And again, as I mentioned, you have here identities in a state of flux, which is almost constant. We like to think of identities as fixed, as something we can readily identify or kind of point to and say, ah, this, you know, I'm a member of X, Y, or Z community, or that person is a member of X, Y, Z or community. But people often understand themselves in more than one way. Um, and I think that would even go for us as members of the human race today. That, you know, when we like to think of who we are, you know, there are maybe 5 or 6 different adjectives we might use to describe ourselves, and to define ourselves. But when we externalize that, we often do the exact opposite. We like to kind of categorize based on, you know, one, maybe 2 criteria. Um, and so that in itself, that disconnect, oftentimes can act as a major drive ingredient for, you know, conflict itself, or at the least promoting tensions, whether through positive or negative experiences. Perspectives change, and identities change along with them. Your textbook mentions this concept and this term of creolization, the blending of cultural characteristics as people adapt to new surroundings and conditions and predicaments. And I think that's what we're getting into with an expression like Afrikaner, or again, American, or, you know, the exportation of slaves and different people to different parts of the world. A blending of old traditions and new practices, whether it's in the form of religious practices and traditions, or even language. This happened with those that were swept up in the African diaspora itself. It also happened elsewhere around the world, in the American colonies, which we'll get a better sense of. In Russia, we can see that with the documentaries from week two, Lucy Worsley's kind of dive into the cultural aspects of early Russia. There would also be other factors that contributed to changing identities. The era of the Enlightenment itself, that we'll focus on, began to shift American, or excuse me, human attention, um, primarily Western attention, to things like rationality and science. That was a new way to understand oneself or begin to identify or define oneself, rather than along the kind of more traditional assumptions and notions of, again, Christian or Protestant, Catholic, or any type of these other um, um, characteristics or markers. Interestingly, and to kind of just give a sneak peek at the implications for the European Enlightenment itself and the principles that it brought about, is that when the Europeans and begin to um, explore and define the Enlightened era for themselves, there is almost immediately a a kind of effort or a questioning of the basic assumptions of the institution of slavery itself. That people, as they become enlightened, as they begin to apply kind of more rational approaches to study, and this would be universal in the case of not only like economics and politics, but also society, and the hard sciences, biology or astronomy or what have you. Philosophy would be another one. When these Europeans begin to grasp onto enlightened principles, they also begin to question the underlying assumptions of the institution of slavery. And late into the 18th century, by 1787, you have the city of Freetown being founded in Sierra Leone, which was designed to aid in the repatriation of freed slaves from Britain and from British colonies. And on May 9th of 1787, some 400 ex-slaves were resettled in Freetown. British abolitionists hoped that this would have a cascading effect and that it would serve to abolish the slave trade altogether. That process would be a lengthy one in the English experience, but also other European powers begin to kind of um, move in the same direction. By 1792, Denmark prohibited the slave trade. And 2 years after that, in 1794, the French National Assembly freed all slaves without compensation to their owners, this occurring amidst the French Revolution. Now, in the case of the French Revolution itself, that movement would, and that liberation would be temporary. That Napoleon would abolish that 1794 precedent, but it was kind of a nod to um, the more modern understandings and foundations of how we view slavery today. That it is immoral in its foundation and its application, uh, and yet fast forwarding even a little bit farther, European powers would come to reassert themselves within the continent of Africa in the latter portions of the 19th century, as I said, with the advent of things like vaccinations to fight tropical diseases that Europeans were particularly susceptible to. Once modern medicine helped to mitigate those kinds of threats, this meant that Europeans could then begin to move into and across the African continent and exact more formalized and direct control, colonial control, imperial control over much of the continent itself, which we will turn attention to in the coming weeks. So I think that gives you a pretty good overview of what was happening across the African continent within the continent itself, and how in many cases it was beginning to grapple with this new uh, uh, you know, demand for slaves, but then also and how the tensions and the instability that created within and between African communities, but then also how this, in many cases, dictated and determined relations with non-African populations coming in from other parts of the world as well. So I'm going to leave things there, and I will see you in the next lecture.